You think your stupid little podcast is going to change the world like hell it is.
But I believe
Your stupid little podcast
can save the world.
Hello, I'm Professor McCoy. Welcome back to my stupid little podcast. I'm flying alone this time, so this is a little bit of a shorter episode compared to some of the previous ones, but I hope you'll enjoy nonetheless. So, to the subject at hand. Today I want to talk about God's relationship to time and what that can tell us about God's relationship to us. So what initially made me really think about this subject was when I was recently rereading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And I happened across his chapter on God and his relationship to time, which is, I believe, chapter 3 of book 4. Where he describes God as being outside of or beyond time. Now, this is an ancient doctrine. This goes back at least to the early Middle Ages and possibly even further back to the Church Fathers. I'm going to talk about a few instances in the history of Christian thought here. But I want to kind of have C.S. Lewis as our touchstone here, because he's a modern thinker who has a very good understanding of God's relationship to time, which is, quite frankly, a very difficult concept to grasp. And I want to read just one small little part, just a sentence, that really grabbed my attention here. He says, speaking of God, that he has all eternity in which to listen to the split second of prayer put up by a pilot as his plane crashes in flames. And now I've put plenty of thought into God's relationship to time and to the philosophy of time more generally. In fact, you'll find linked in the description here a long video I've made on the philosophy of time, specifically in relation to Marvel's Loki TV series and the problems with time travel there. To the point where I consider myself decently well-read when it comes to the philosophy of time, even though generally thinking about it too hard tends to make my head hurt. I do it anyway sometimes. But this gave me a very different reaction, a very different response than my usual mild frustration at thinking of the philosophy of time. That I'd never really thought of God's relationship to time, God's eternity, in terms of how it impacts his relationship to us, his creatures. And so I want to start sort of laying out some things that we can learn about and things that we can think about with respect to God and with respect to his eternity and his relationship to temporality, before we sort of circle back to what that has to say about his relation to us and how even though we are in time, how God relates to us from eternity. So first I want to move back a little bit, again to C.S. Lewis, where he, in the same chapter, talks about the problem of divine foreknowledge. In the same chapter, C.S. Lewis explains what we can call the problem of predestination. He says, quote, "Another difficulty we get if we believe God to be in time is this. Everyone who believes in God at all believes that he knows what you and I are going to do tomorrow. But if he knows I am going to do so-and-so, how can I be free to do otherwise?" End quote. This is a very old problem. This is something that Augustine worked out a bit, but I think that it was answered the most succinctly and the most clearly by Anselm of Canterbury. And it was answered in roughly the same way that Lewis answers the question. Now, before I want to either talk about Lewis's answer or Anselm's answer, which, again, are roughly the same, I do want to bring our attention to the fact that Lewis is being awfully presumptive here to say that everyone who believes in God at all believes that he knows the truth value of future events. That isn't quite the case, because there are what are known today as open theists. That is to say, people who believe that God is in time, in the same way that we are, that time is very strictly what we would call an A series, rather than a B series. A B series being an eternal, untensed model of time. That is to say, there's no unique now Whereas an A series is time which progresses, which there is a true sense in which now exists, the future does not yet, and the past no longer does. But for the open theist, God is as much in time and in the present as we are. It's just that God has a profound degree of knowledge of that present, such that he can reliably predict the future. But it is still a prediction rather than knowledge in a direct apperceptive kind of sense. And so there are, in fact, people who believe in God who do not think that God knows what we will do tomorrow, in the same sense that he knows what we are doing right now and what we did yesterday. Now, I do find this view to be particularly weak. I think that it dramatically limits not only God's knowledge, but also it limits God's existence in profound ways that we'll look at a little more when I start talking about Aquinas and how he describes God's eternity and timelessness. Now, another view that attempts to answer the question of predestination is what's referred to as Molinism. And I'm probably going to have to, at some point, do a completely separate video or even podcast episode on Molinism, because I think that it fails spectacularly, but for reasons that I'd rather not get fully into right here. It is essentially the view that God has what is called middle knowledge. Middle knowledge is defined as knowledge of the truth value of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. That is to say, God knows with certainty what I would do under such and such circumstances. Right? So if God wants to actualize a certain future, that is to say, if God wants me to do a certain thing, then he can make certain that that does happen. But not by directly causing me to do something, but by altering the circumstances I find myself in, such that I will invariably act in a certain way. Now, again, I have tremendous problems with this view, but that's for another time. I'll have to get back to it. Now, as for Anselm's answer, I want to read briefly from his dialogue, De Casu Diaboli, that is, On the Fall of the Devil, from chapter 21, which discusses that the evil angel could not foreknow that he was going to fall. So this is, he's talking about, in the broader context, angelic foreknowledge, and then therefore how that applies to our own foreknowledge as human beings, as finite creatures. But he takes a moment to digress to instead discuss divine foreknowledge, that is to say, God's knowledge of the future. So he says, quote, "God's foreknowledge is not properly called foreknowledge. To him, everything is always present, so he does not have foreknowledge of what is future, but simply knowledge of what is present. So, since the argument regarding foreknowledge of a future thing differs from that regarding knowledge of a present thing, divine foreknowledge need not have the same implications as the foreknowledge we are asking about now." End quote. Now, we can look at C.S. Lewis's description and see just how similar his answer is to Anselm's, which makes me think that he was, in large part, at least, if not directly, certainly through the tradition, inspired by Anselm's answer. So, we, to quote Lewis, again, the same chapter of Mere Christianity, he says, "But suppose God is outside and above the timeline. In that case, what we call tomorrow is visible to him in just the same way as what we call today. All the days are now for him. He does not remember you doing things yesterday, he simply sees you doing them, because, though you have lost yesterday, he has not. He does not foresee you doing things tomorrow, he simply sees you doing them, because, though tomorrow is not yet there for you, it is for him. You never suppose that your actions in this moment were any less free because God knows what you are doing. Well, he knows your tomorrow's actions in just the same way, because he is already in tomorrow and can simply watch you. In a sense, he does not know your action till you have done it. But then, the moment at which you have done it is already now for him." So, Lewis explains this, I think, more thoroughly at greater length. And I will also say in a more accessible way, I would say, as well. But a lot of that is attributable to Lewis's talent as a popular author. He's not only a good philosopher, but he is an excellent communicator, I will say. And so, what we find here is, again, roughly the same answer, which is essentially this, that God does not exist at any particular point in time. God exists at all times, in the very same way. God is eternal in the sense of not just without beginning or without end, but existing fully throughout all time, right? Not merely existing now, but existing just as fully in the future and in the past. Now, the precise nature of how this works, Anselm does not answer specifically in that dialogue. He talks about it somewhat elsewhere. And Lewis sort of punts on the issue because he doesn't find it to be, one, easy to understand or easy to explain, but then also all that necessary to answer the questions that he's interested in answering. Which is another thing that I think that Lewis does quite well, especially in his more popular works, which is when he comes to a difficult question, he gives as simple an answer as he possibly can to cover the bases, without having to go into too much theological depth. I will say, as my own academic instincts go the other direction. I have the impulse to try desperately to explain the most complex concepts, and I will often get lost in the weeds. Whether that is in my stupid little podcast here, or whether that's in the classroom, or whether that's to my own children, I tend to try desperately to over-explain things rather than to stick to what's strictly necessary. With that having been said, let's dive into the weeds of Thomas Aquinas. Because while a lot of philosophers have considered the implications of God's relationship to time, what that relationship can be described as, it's Aquinas, as with many things, who goes into extreme depth and detail as to how we can actually explain it and not merely describe it. And so I'm going to be taking this from question 10 of the Prima Pars of the Summa Theologiae, which is the section on the eternity of God. Which is in the section on the divine attributes. And so I want to look at Article 1, Article 2, and then Article 5. Article 1 is trying to pin down the definition of eternity. What does it mean? And so his proposed definition comes from Boethius, from the Consolation of Philosophy, which is, quote, "Eternity is the simultaneously whole and perfect possession of interminable life." And so he considers his various objections, as Aquinas usually does, and he ultimately winds up concluding that, yes, this is in fact correct. This is the best way to understand eternity. So because of that, we can sort of go through our definition and try to more carefully explain it. So to try to understand exactly how he's going to expand upon Boethius' definition, I want to read a section of his answer where he affirms Boethius' definition and then expands upon it further. So he says, "As we attain to the knowledge of simple things by way of compound things, so we must reach to the knowledge of eternity by means of time, which is nothing but the numbering of movement by before and after. For since succession occurs in every movement, and one part comes after another, the fact that we reckon before and after in movement make us apprehend time, which is nothing else but the measure of before and after in movement." So when Aquinas is talking about movement here, he's using this as a technical term. He's using it in the same sense that we find in his first way of demonstrating God's existence, his argument from motion. Movement here means change. It is the reduction of potentiality to actuality. It is the actualization of potential qualities into something really being a certain way. So when he talks about something moving, he could be talking about something moving from place to place, but he also could be moving, the movement could be from one state of being to another state of being. So for example, one might move from say, one's desk to the light switch. But one might also move the light from off to on. And for Aquinas, we're not just talking about the motion of one's finger to the switch and the switch from the down position to the up position. He's also talking about the motion of the light from being dark to being light, from having no current flowing through it to having current flowing through it. Right? All of these things are what Aquinas would call motion. You would also call things motion like something a lot less tangible, like learning. Right? If you learn some new information, say you learn the definition of motion as meant by Thomas Aquinas, or you learn the definition of eternity as proposed by Boethius, your mind is moving from potentially having this knowledge to actually having it. And he points out that for anything which changes, that is to say, anything which has potential that can be actualized, this motion happens in time. That is to say, it happens in sequence. One thing happens and then another thing happens. One way of looking at this is to point out that in order for something to move, or in order for something to change, it has to change from one state to another state. And motion or change, in that sense, cannot be comprehensible except in the concept of time. Right? So for something to move means that at one point in time, it was a certain way. And then at another point, again, in time, it was another way. To explain motion or change without the concept of time, it would be incoherent to try to describe what it's moving from to what it's moving to. So in other words, without sequence, without ordering, you cannot coherently explain motion or change. And so for Aquinas, the concept of change, that is motion, that is actualization, is inseparable from the concept of time. Okay, so far so good, hopefully. If you need to rewind and re-listen, I understand. It may also help to have this section of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae pulled up, just so you can kind of follow along for parts of it. If that helps. Aquinas is a little bit difficult to understand just reading, but let's go through it anyway. So, the point of all this is not to try to describe time or describe motion or change. The point of this is to take that understanding of time and of motion and extrapolate from that what eternity must mean, how that works, how eternity works, based on our understanding of how time works. So skipping ahead a little bit, he continues. Now, in a thing bereft of movement, which is always the same, there is no before or after. As therefore the idea of time consists in the numbering of before and after in movement, so likewise the apprehension of the uniformity of what is outside of movement consists the idea of eternity. Okay, so again, he's playing the flip side here of that necessary and intrinsic connection between motion or change on the one hand and time on the other. So if we were to have something which is eternal, all that means is so that it neither does nor can undergo change. Now, I want to skip ahead a little bit to the second article in this question, which is whether God is eternal. So this is where Aquinas actually argues that God is eternal and explains how that is and what that means. Not just what the concept of eternity is, but how that specifically applies to God. Now, in his answer, which is, if you're familiar with Aquinas' format, the quadlibital question, his I answer that is where he most clearly puts forward his position and explains it. He says the following, quote, "The idea of eternity follows immutability, as the idea of time follows movement, as appears from the preceding article. Hence, as God is supremely immutable, it supremely belongs to him to be eternal." End quote. So what he's doing here is simply and straightforwardly tying God's eternity to his immutability. So immutability here means God being incapable of being changed. God is always the same. Nothing changes in God. No changes happen to God. God does not change himself. In fact, it would be impossible for God to change himself. Now, again, you can look to Aquinas' question on divine immutability. if you want more explanation of this, or even you can look to a lot of other philosophers who have covered the topic of divine immutability, the idea that God cannot change. This is one of the more common divine attributes, even beyond Christianity. This goes all the way back to Plato, and who in several places explains that the divine, whatever it is, must be perfect, and to be perfect, it must be unchangeable. Now, for Aquinas here, he is linking that immutability, which he sees as a more fundamental divine attribute, to eternity. So we know that God is eternal because we know that God is immutable. In other words, that God does not change. And what it means to not change is to not be in time, to not exist temporally, to not reduce potentiality to actuality. Because again, if you recall, you may or may not recall this, but if you've followed my material, I hope you recall this, that part of the classical, especially Thomistic definition of God is pure actuality. That is to say, something which has no potential, that there's nothing else that it could be but is not. And if something has no potential, if there's nothing that it could be otherwise, then there's nothing for it to change into or change from. And so it must be pure act or pure actuality. This is part of the definition of God as ipsum esse subsistens, that is to say, pure substantial being itself, or being, capital B. And so God, in this sense, there's nothing that God could be but isn't, could have but doesn't, or used to have but doesn't anymore, or even could have had but is this way instead. Right? God is perfection itself, being itself. And so there's no even coherence to say that God does or even could change. And because of that, that links to, or that it flows from that, God's absolute eternity, his being outside of time, existing beyond time, so to speak. Now, I also want to take a brief stopover in Article 3, which is whether to be eternal belongs to God alone. That is to say, whether there are other things which are truly eternal in the same, or at least an analogical sense. And Aquinas will ultimately conclude that eternity, quote, truly and properly so called, is in God alone. However, he goes on to explain that some other things receive their immutability from him, and therefore share in his eternity in different respects and to different degrees. So, in other words, again, by analogy, Aquinas is big on analogical predication between creatures and God. That is to say, we can't say exactly the same things of creatures, that is to say, things God made, and God himself, but we can make analogical comparisons between the two. So that is to say, we can't say that anything is eternal in the same way that God is eternal. However, we can say that the way that God created certain things makes them kind of eternal, or similar to God's eternity in relevant respects. And so he lists a bunch of things, a lot of which are scriptural references, where a lot of the poets, especially throughout the Old Testament, describe things as eternal, right? Saying that the earth standeth forever, and that the hills are called eternal in the Psalms and in Deuteronomy, right? But he wants to point out that that doesn't actually mean that they are eternal in the same sense that God is, because even if the earth and the natural things would last forever, which we know that it won't through Revelation, right? But even if it were to last forever, it did have a beginning in time. Right? Again, we know through Revelation. But even if it didn't have a beginning in time, right? Even if God created the world, quote, eternally, so to speak, without beginning or without end, then it would still not quite be eternal in the full sense that God is, because even the hills which last forever, even the earth which lasts forever, even the universe which lasts forever, goes through change. And so it does exist in time, unlike God, which is perfectly and completely immutable. Okay, but the other thing that he brings out, the other example which he says are kind of similar to being eternal, but not quite in the same sense as God, which are angels and the blessed who enjoy the word. That is to say, people in heaven are in some sense eternal. That which is experiencing eternal life, right? That is all over Scripture. It's all over the Church Fathers. It's all over the Scholastics. It's all over modern Christian theology as well. Heaven, or the new creation, being, quote, eternal life, is hard to dispense with, even if you're trying to be philosophically precise. And so we have to ask, okay, well, what exactly does that mean? Well, a couple of things. First of all, he points out that the possibility is that by eternal there, we just kind of mean it by analogy, or by loose analogy, that it just means unending, right? But he also doesn't quite want to say that, right? He wants to say, quote, he quotes Augustine here, as regards that vision of the Word, that is, Word, capital W, Christ, no changing thoughts exist in the saints. Hence, going back to Aquinas, hence those who see God are said to have eternal life. According to that text, this is eternal life, that they may know the only true God, etc. According to the Gospel of John. So this is so his point here is that the eternal life of the saints, that including the angels, is different in kind from merely endless or everlasting life, because in the contemplation of God, of the Word in particular, of Jesus, we partake in some sense in God's eternity. So even though we have changed, now whether the angels changed is a separate question, we'll get to that, but even though we as human beings have changed, he posits here, and this follows Augustine, that in the next life there is nothing to change, right? At least at our most essential and most important parts, because the most important thing that we will be doing is knowing and loving and worshiping God, and God is unchanging. So even if we are moving around in a corporeal sense, in the new heavens and the new earth, then we will be fundamentally that part which makes us human, and that part which makes us bearers of the image and likeness of God, that part will be fundamentally unchanging, because it is enjoying the beatific vision, which is itself immutable. Now, this is perhaps a little bit reliant on Aquinas' particular theology of the beatific vision, which is that we will be very beautiful and very glowing bodies standing perfectly still forever, beholding God. And that is a very Dominican, view of the next life, and that was one of the major theological debates between the Dominicans and the Franciscans throughout the medieval period. But I digress. That's maybe maybe another topic for another time. But for now, it doesn't quite, I don't think quite affects his point here, which is that our contact with God, our being in the direct presence of God, lends us a kind of categorically different type of life that makes it eternal, insofar as we share in the divine eternity and the divine immutability. Now, before I move on to angels, which are far more complicated, because of course they are, actually, that's not fair. This is actually one of the few cases where angels are more complex to philosophically consider than human beings are, and this is why a lot of the scholastics used angels in their thought experiments, because they're far, far simpler and more straightforward. But I digress again. Before we get to angels, I do also want to talk about one other kind of thing which is called eternal, that Aquinas wants to make a little caveat for. And this is his third objection and reply in that same Article 3, where he says, every necessary thing is eternal, but there are many necessary things, as for instance all principles of demonstration and all demonstrative propositions. And he answers that necessary means a certain mode of truth. And this is distinguished from a certain mode of being. Not this, end quote. Sorry, I'll come back to the quote. But this is distinguished from a certain kind of necessary being, which again, he argues elsewhere, belongs only to God, right? The only existence which exists of necessity, and is not merely true of necessity, is God himself. Now, going on, quote, truth, according to the philosopher, that is Aristotle, is in the mind. Therefore, in this sense, the true and necessary are eternal, because they are in the eternal mind, which is the divine intellect alone. Hence, it does not follow that anything beside God is eternal. So, this is where we get, or this is where he explains the doctrine of the divine ideas. And of course, he cites Aristotle here, but it's worth pointing out that this is a doctrine which finds its roots far more deeply in Plato than in Aristotle. The doctrine of the divine ideas is a sort of Neoplatonist development of Plato's doctrine of the forms, which placed the forms, these eternal necessary concepts, in the mind of God in order to make them, to give them the qualities that they would need to have in order to function like Plato's forms in a theistic context. And so what he's pointing out here is that, sure, there are these other things which are eternal, right? It is eternally true. The basic principles of logic and mathematics and things like that are eternally true. And it's even eternally true that, for example, I am recording this on Ash Wednesday, for example. But despite that being eternally true, it is true of a particular moment, but whatever. It is always true, and always was true, and always will be true, that this is when this happened, right? Propositions are true eternally. Right? They're not set in time. They might be indexed to time. They might be about a particular time, but they are always true, always have been, always will be, so long as they are, in fact, true. Now, the way that Aquinas is laying this out and making this kind of work without all of these various propositions, because there are functionally an infinite number of true propositions, without all of these being co-eternal with God and yet independent from God, he just makes them dependent upon God. He places them into the divine intellect. In other words, he rolls them in with omniscience. So for God to be omniscient is for God to know all true propositions. And so therefore, all true propositions are in the divine intellect, in the mind of God, are expressions of God's omniscience, rather than being some standalone propositional thing, which would have of its own, on its own accord, some kind of eternity and necessity. Now, finally, we get to the complicated question. That is the question of angels, and what is the angelic relationship to time. And this will eventually bring us back around to C.S. Lewis. But first, we're going to have to slog through some of the most complicated arguments that Thomas Aquinas makes, and that's saying a lot. Aquinas, as you may know, is known as the angelic doctor. And that is not because of any personality trait that he may have had or may have now. It is not to say that he is or is either literally or metaphorically angelic, but rather that he talked a lot about the angels. So, with respect to time, Aquinas describes the angels as being what he calls aveternal, or having aveternity or aveternity. And this is laid out in Article 5 of that same question. And he's once again leaning a bit on Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, as especially his on the contrary direct quote from Boethius, who commandeth time to be separate from aveternity. And so I'm just going to quote from his I Answer That. We're going to go through at least some of this in some detail, because Aquinas does give a pretty thorough explanation, but it's one that might require some slowing down and explicating. So, quote, "Aeviternity differs from time and from eternity as the mean between them both. The difference is explained by some to consist in the fact that eternity has neither beginning nor end, aeviternity, a beginning but no end, and time both beginning and end." Okay, so pause. He's ultimately going to disagree with this distinction, so don't get that locked in your head. That is, I believe, how Boethius laid out the distinctions, but he is going to go into a very different way of making the distinction, which does not rely on beginnings, ends, both or neither, but instead talks about the essence of one's relationship to time and how that works. So, moving on, continuing the quote. "This difference, however, is but an accidental one, as was shown above in the preceding article," quote, end quote, which we did not read, but so don't panic. Continuing, "Because even if aeviternal things had always been and would always be, as some think, and even if they might sometimes fail to be, which is possible to God to allow, even granted this, aeviternity would still be distinguished from eternity and from time." Okay, so this is related to that little discussion about necessary things. So necessary truths, and we can ask, well, what if things existed that were like that, but were separate from God? Right, so what if God created the world, or some aspect of the world, from eternity past, and with no future end? I also use the example of this in relation to the scriptural quotes about the hills and the earth being eternal, right? And so we have to sort of speculate. Well, what if God had created something like this that had no beginning and no end, but a sequence of mutable changes through time? Well, we wouldn't call that eternal. We wouldn't even call it aeviternal. We would just call it without beginning or end, right? Endless or something like that. We'd have to speak more precisely about it. It would only be eternal or aeviternal by analogy. It wouldn't be essentially. So he continues. "Others assign the difference between these three to consist in the fact that eternity has no before and after, but that time has both, together with innovation and veteration, and that aeviternity has before and after, without innovation and veteration. This theory, however, involves a contradiction which manifestly appears if innovation and veteration be referred to the measure itself," blah, blah, blah. I'm going to skip this a little bit because, and I'm also going to kind of hand wave, because we don't really need to know all the differences and distinctions about what this means and where this comes from, because he's just including it here, even in the I Answer That portion, to shuffle it off and to ignore it and to move on. And so he goes through a little bit of this, right? And he goes through a few things, and eventually he actually comes to something like a definition of aeviternity that he settles on, and that he argues does in fact correctly describe the angels. He says, quote, "We say then that since eternity is the measure of a permanent being, insofar as anything recedes from permanence of being, it recedes from eternity. Now, some things recede from permanence of being so that their being is subject to change or consists in change, and these things are measured by time, as are all movements, and also the being of all things corruptible." Right, pause. So here he's just talking about temporal things like us, like any other given being, material being in the world, things that God creates, which recede from eternity. In other words, they're not eternal. They're farther away from being eternal, and the reason for that is that they actualize potential. Their potential is actualized. They change. They move. They do not exist consistently, coherently. They exist from one state to another in motion, just like we talked about back in the first article. But he continues, "But others recede less from permanence of being, for as much as their being neither consists in change, nor is the subject of change, nevertheless they have change annexed to them, either actually or potentially. Okay, pause. What does this mean? So this is saying that there are things that God either creates, or at least could create, which do not change in their being, nor are they subject to change in their being. But he says, nevertheless, have change annexed to them, either actually or potentially. In other words, they either do or could have change, quote, annexed to them. Now, what this means is what, more or less, what modern philosophers would call, or at least something like what modern philosophers would call a, quote, mere Cambridge change. Which is that is to say, a change in relational qualities rather than in the essence of the thing itself, right? So, for example, let's say I am taller than my father, right? And so, to say that my father is shorter than me is true. As of right now, not by much, a little bit. I inched over him just ever so slightly as I got old enough. But I wasn't always, right? I was not always taller than my father. When I was a small child, I was much shorter than him, and so I changed, in a very real sense, from being shorter than my father to being taller than my father. Okay, cool. However, it's a different thing to say that my father changed from being taller than me to being shorter than me. Because he hasn't shrunk, right? Not yet. He's not that old. He used to be taller than me and became, quote, improperly speaking, shorter than me. But how that happened was that the other thing changed. He did not. Right? He remained constant in his being, even in his accidental characteristics. I'm the one that changed. But because I changed and he did not, the relationship between us, the comparison, changed. And so his what we call Cambridge qualities, this is coming from analytic philosophers out of Cambridge University, talk about this a whole lot, or did throughout the 20th century, that these qualities that, say, in this case, my father have changed because other things have changed in relation to him. Okay, now, when Aquinas talks about change being annexed to these things, he does mean a little bit more than that, right? He does talk about it being, well, let's just go on. Let's quote and give his examples. Quote, this appears in the heavenly bodies, the substantial being of which is unchangeable. And yet, with unchangeable being, they have changeableness of place. The same applies to angels, who have an unchangeable being as regards their nature, with changeableness as regards choice. Moreover, they have changeableness of intelligence, of affections, and of places in their own degree. Okay, so first of all, when he's talking about heavenly bodies, you have to remember that Aquinas is working on a medieval cosmology, where heavenly bodies are perfect spheres. They do not ever change in any way, and that they go through their courses in the sky, in beyond the purely material realm, the sublunary realm, if you will. So the stars and the planets are not thought of as, we would think of them now as worlds like our own. I'm really tempted to go off on a tangent, but I will restrain myself because there are some fascinating things to talk about there. Maybe for another time. In any case, though, if these things are, again, if we're just talking, we can just talk hypothetically here, right? If these things are, in their essence, utterly unchangeable, they still change place. They still change in reference to each other, right? They are in different configurations in the sky. And they change in reference to the earth, right? But they themselves don't. The same, he says, applies to angels. They also change sort of in place, though being immaterial, angels being strictly immaterial. What we mean by place there is a little bit less precise. This is where he talks about this elsewhere, but briefly. when we speak of an angel being in a place, what we really mean by that, according to Aquinas, is that that place, that material place, is where the angel is attending to, whether that is directing its intellect or directing its will to a particular place, right? So when an angel appears, as, to a person or to people, the angel is directing its will here and now to this place, to these individuals, or to this individual. Right? That's what it says to mean that to say that the angel appeared, say, before Mary. Right? It's to say that the angel, Gabriel in this case, directed his will and his intellect to that particular location at that time. Right? But the angel Gabriel remained unchanged. It's just that where he directed his will and intellect changed. And this is also part of what he means when he says they have changeableness of intelligence or affections. Right, so changeableness of intelligence means that they can attend to different things and perhaps can learn things. Now that one is debatable. But generally speaking, we would probably have to say that they can learn things. Anselm certainly thinks so. As best I understand the question, Aquinas thinks so, and that is probably the majority position, but it is, like I said, it's a little debatable. And affections, of course, that much kind of has to be obvious because some of the angels fell. Their affections changed from God to self. Now, I also briefly want to look at one of his objections and replies, that is the objection and reply number 3, where he considers another element of the relationship between aeviternity and temporal duration and change, substantial change, not mere Cambridge change, right? So, quote, if there is no before or after in aeviternity, it follows that in aeviternal things there is no difference between being, having been, or going to be. Since then it is impossible for aeviternal things not to have been, it follows that it is impossible for them not to be in the future, which is false, since God can reduce them to nothing, end quote. Now, I'd also add that it seems to follow from that it is impossible for God to have created them, because they never came into being, or at least not created them in time, that they have always existed for eternity. But then also, it seems that that God could not have not created them, could not have there could not have been a time when they were not, which seems not to be the case, right? Now, why this is important is because for aeviternal things, it seems to be that it gives them a kind of immutability. If God cannot cause them to not exist, then it seems like they are immutable in a similar sense to God, which would make them eternal. So, okay, a reply to objection 3, quote, in the very being of an angel considered absolutely, there is no difference of past and future, but only as regards accidental change. Now, to say that an angel was or is or will be is to be taken in a different sense according to the acceptation of our intellect, which apprehends the angelic existence by comparison with different parts of time. But when we say that an angel is or was, we suppose something, which being supposed, is its opposite is not subject to the divine power. Whereas, when we say he will be, we do not yet suppose anything. Hence, since the existence and non-existence of an angel, considered absolutely, is subject to the divine power, God can make the existence of an angel not future, but he cannot cause him not to be while he is, or not to have been after he has been. Okay, that is complex. Like I said, I did kind of promise that this is some of the more complex stuff that Aquinas argues, and again, that's saying something, but let's go through this very, very gradually, very, very slowly. So, God can obviously bring angels into being and remove them from being. How does that jive with aeviternity? That is to say, the essence being unchanging and perhaps even unchangeable, And the only differences, the only changes being their relationship to changing things. By contrast, when he's talking about our perception of angels changing, he wants to say that those changes are merely perceptual because they are in relation to us, and we are in fact changing. So when we say that an angel was, or was not, or will be, or will not be, we only say that because we exist in time, and our present is constantly changing. Right? I exist right now. I no longer exist. However many minutes ago I started recording this, and I was about to say I will no longer exist, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is I do not yet exist, say, when you are listening to this. There we go. That's more correct, right? For me, right now is right now. For me, it is not yet whenever you happen to listen to this. And it is no longer when I started recording. And so if I were to say that, the angel Gabriel will exist when you listen to this, that is almost certainly correct, but it needn't be. Okay, so how does he make that work? How does Aquinas make that work? He says, God can make the existence of an angel not future, but he cannot cause him not to be while he is, or not to have been after he has been. So that means that he is understanding an angel, or angelic existence, in an atemporal way, but in relation to temporal things. In other words, this is my interpretation, by the way. I don't want to give the idea that I'm giving a one-for-one reading of Aquinas. But this is something like the idea that, again, using modern terminology, we exist as an A series of time, as presentists, right? The present moment is really real because it is what we have changed into and what we have not yet changed out of. But angels exist in relationship to time in a very different way, as if time were a B series, right? Their time, angelic time, so to speak, time with scare quotes, is more like a B series or a block theory of time. Angels exist from the moment of their creation to the moment of their hypothetical destruction, all throughout, simultaneously, so to speak. Their existence from point to point along that, quote, time, again, scare quotes, does not change in any way, but it is limited. It is not infinite. It is not immutable in the same way that God is. So, the angel Gabriel, to use this example, was created at roughly the beginning of time. Roughly, give or take. And could, in theory, though probably not in fact, but in theory, could pass out of being if God causes him not to be in the future. But that would be God causing Gabriel to have a limit in time. That would not be God deleting him, so to speak, right? So the difference is that God creates the angel Gabriel all at once throughout his entire timeline, is another way of looking at this. Rather than bringing him into being at the beginning of his time and then taking him out of being at the end of it, God is creating and sustaining his entire sort of block of existence from beginning to end simultaneously, so to speak. And the angels experience, I guess, is one maybe analogical, but let's go with it. They experience that block of time as a single block of time. Okay, confused enough yet? If so, how about a nice illustration that might actually help us to get a hold of this rather complex idea of eternity and the angel's relationship to time. And for that, I want to circle all the way back to C.S. Lewis And instead of looking at mere Christianity this time, I want to actually look at some of his fiction. In this case, I want to look at the second chapter of the second book of his space trilogy, that is Perelandra. Now, I'll just note, this is my first time reading through this series of books. I'm reading it with our book club in Discord. So, shameless little plug. If you are interested in those sorts of things and these kinds of discussions, go check us out. If you're not in the Discord server, you're welcome there. Link in the description. But we're currently partway through, as of this recording at least, partway through the third and final book in that trilogy, That Hideous Strength, which, I'm going to have some stuff to talk about there for a future episode of the podcast, I'm sure. But for now, I want to draw our attention to C.S. Lewis's description of what are essentially angels and how they're interacting with the human characters in the novel. I'm going to substitute some words here, so this isn't quite going to be a direct quotation, because he has sort of alien language words for different types of angels. I'm just going to say angel, just for simplicity's sake. But in any case, let's see. This is going to be from, as I said, chapter 2 of Perelandra. Quote, "We must be going soon," said Ransom, the main character. "Not until he, the angel, comes back," said I being C.S. Lewis as the narrator. "Though indeed, now that the thing was so near, I wished it to be over." "He has never left us," said Ransom. "He has been in the cottage all the time." "You mean he has been waiting in the next room all these hours?" "Not waiting. They never have that experience. You and I are conscious of waiting, because we have a body that grows tired or restless, and therefore a sense of cumulative duration. Also, we can distinguish duties in spare time, and therefore have a conception of leisure. It's not like that with him. He has been there all this time, but you can no more call it waiting than you can call the whole of his existence waiting. You might as well say that a tree in a wood was waiting, or the sunlight waiting on the side of a hill." So I think this is this is a spectacular illustration of what I've been talking about, this aveternal state of angelic beings, that because they are not physical, because they're not material, they don't have the same kind of temporal existence that we do. However, they do very obviously have a relationship to time. And so this angel, this angelic being, Malacandra is his or its name. It does exist, and it does interact with time, and it does, in a sort of sense of the term, wait. It is there. It exists. It is existing over there in anticipation of the next instance of its of it doing the thing that it intends to do, which, again, I'm being sort of vague about this. I don't want to get into the plot details, for one, because I think you should read it. It's a fantastic series, but then also because if I get too deep into the weeds of this series, it'll be nothing but confusing if you haven't read it. In any case, though, as he says, they don't have the experience of waiting. And so because they don't have a sense of cumulative duration, what they have is an all-at-once existence, some points of which are active, some points of which are passive, some points of which it's doing this, some points of which it's doing that, and some points of which it's between doing this and doing that. But the between doesn't feel, so to speak, like a kind of waiting over a duration. So I think, again, like Lewis is so good at, I think he does a phenomenal job here of illustrating a concept, which I'm sure he is familiar with, being a medievalist. He has studied the thought of the Middle Ages very extensively, so I'm sure he is familiar with the questions from St. Thomas Aquinas that we were just reading, at least somewhat familiar. And even if that was not directly before his mind when writing this passage, surely that concept, which is received through the Christian tradition, was. And so I think that he does a wonderful job here of giving us a nice illustration to help understand something that is so incredibly difficult to understand. And I will say, the philosophy of time and even more so the theology of time, is tremendously difficult to understand. But I think that Lewis's illustrations here, between this one and, of course, his other illustration, which I'll just repeat, I'll end with that, because I think that it's just insightful and incredibly beautiful. I think that Lewis is just phenomenal at giving us these illustrations of concepts that are so difficult, like the philosophy of time, but also like all other sorts of aspects of theology. And that's one of his primary strengths as an author and as a philosopher and as a fiction and nonfiction writer. So just to sort of end on this, I think this is a wonderful note to end on. But before we wrap with that, thanks for listening. So feel free to, as I said, join in the Discord. Feel free to catch me on my live streams, my other videos. Check out the rest of the YouTube channel. Check out the rest of the Spotify, etc., all of that wonderful stuff. And I'll leave you with this. He, that is God, has all eternity in which to listen to the split second of prayer put up by a pilot as his plane crashes in flames. And I will say the same is to us. So take that moment, or those moments, or however long you need to, and be with God there forever, right there with you. Hope you have a blessed Lent. I hope I do as well. God bless. See you next time.